Thanks very much for inviting me to be with you in Baltimore on this steamy July night. I'm grateful for what the American Battlefield Trust has been doing to preserve our common heritage, but I'm particularly grateful for what you folks do. For every scribbler like me who has found some success in life, there are teachers like you who made it happen, who opened eyes and opened doors. For me, it was a guy named Bert B. Cohen. He was a history teacher in Alexandria, Virginia, about 50 miles south of here. Mr. Cohen taught a 2-year course for high school freshmen and sophomores called simply Ancient and Medieval History. And he realized that the best tool for understanding the past is imagination. And he put electrical voltage into history that for me has never stopped buzzing. So for those of you who are doing the hard work of teaching and teaching in the spirit of Mr. Cohen, thank you. I'm going to talk for a bit. I will not read. And then we'll open it up to your questions and your comments. So the great Harvard naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison told us that we ought to read history because it will help us to behave better. Now this from a man who, when interrupted one day while working at his desk by a barking dog, went outside and shot it. One thing we know for sure about history is that it is, like life, infernally complicated. We see it in the current reevaluation of Robert E. Lee and Confederate leaders, in the skepticism about indiscriminate Allied bombing of German and Japanese civilian targets in World War II, in our reasons for waging war in Vietnam, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. Rarely do we find history simple, linear, neatly beveled, sanded, and varnished smooth. And so it is with the American Revolution, which to my eye makes it all the more compelling. I've spent all of my professional life writing about war, including a long stint, as David mentioned, at the Washington Post as a foreign correspondent and a war correspondent, in places like Somalia and Bosnia and Iraq and Afghanistan. I eventually decided to go straight and become a recovering journalist. And instead of writing about war as a journalist, using the longer, wider lens to write about it as a historian, combining the historical method with the narrative art. I spent nearly 15 years writing a 3-volume, 750,000-word narrative about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II. And even before that final volume was published in 2013, I was pondering what to do next, and I kept thinking about Jack London's advice that rather than sit back and wait for inspiration, a writer ought to light out after it with a club. The obvious thing for me would have been to pivot to the Pacific and to do for that campaign in World War II what I had done for the campaigns in the Mediterranean and Western Europe, but that would have required me to start World War II all over again at Pearl Harbor or even earlier, and that didn't have much appeal. And besides, I couldn't shake a fascination, personal fascination with a different war in an earlier century. So I took my club and I set out after it. I'm now about halfway through the 2nd volume of what I hope, knock wood, will be another trilogy. I started chapter 12 this morning. There will be 26. The British Are Coming, which was published in 2019, opens with an extended prologue in June 1773. When King George III travels to Portsmouth on the southern coast of England for a 4-day review of the Royal Navy. It's a fantastic, proud display of military muscle, precisely a decade after the creation of the first British Empire, with victory over the French and the Spanish in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War as we know it. 1773 is the year the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was coined. And the book ends with the 2 battles of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton in January 1777, which together resuscitated American hopes that had seemed all but extinguished. And this second volume that I'm working on now, in addition to recounting those fraught events at Brandywine and Germantown and Valley Forge and Monmouth, we'll see the revolution become a global war with the entry of France and then Spain into the fight, even as American hopes again dwindle almost to the vanishing point. Let me suggest there is a lot to dislike about the founders and the war they fought for American independence. The stirring assertion that all men are created equal did not, of course, apply to 500,000 black slaves. 1 in 5 of all souls occupying the 13 colonies when those fine words were written in 1776, nor was it valid for Native Americans, women, or indigents. For the 8-year duration of the American Revolution, those who remained loyal to the British Crown and even those who were skeptical about armed rebellion against their government were often subjected to dreadful treatment, public shaming, disenfranchisement, confiscation, beatings, torture, exile, and sometimes execution. Some were imprisoned on Hudson River scows anchored just below Albany, or in an old Connecticut copper mine lowered by windlass 70 feet below ground into rock-walled cells known simply as hell. Partisan belligerence metastasized into civil war. John Adams later admitted, "I would have hanged my own brother had he taken part with our enemy in the contest." Conformity, censorship, and zealotry flourished. In a defensive war waged for liberty and to secure basic rights, the Americans promptly invaded Canada in an attempt to win by force of arms what could not be won by blandishment and negotiation, a 14th colony. This was the first, but hardly the last, American invasion of another land under the pretext of bettering life for the invaded. The enduring image of a yeoman farmer leaving his plow in the furrow to grab his musket on behalf of freedom is mostly mythical. During the Revolution, General Washington rarely had an army of larger than 20,000 troops. Sometimes it was as small as 3,000, this in a country of 2.5 million people. Especially after the initial martial enthusiasms aroused at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill faded in 1775, relatively few American men volunteered for service in the American Continental Army, especially if it involved enlisting for the duration in the badly armed, badly fed, badly clothed, and often badly led American Continental Army. And yet, who would deny that the creation story of our founding remains valid, vivid, and thrilling? Even in July 2023, a moment when national unity is elusive, when the simple concept of truth is assailed, when our partisan rancor seems ever more toxic, that story, the story informs who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and perhaps the most profound question any people can ask themselves, what they were willing to die for. Indeed, at least 25,000 Americans died for the cause, possibly many more. It's a larger proportion of our population to perish in any conflict other than the Civil War. So what can we learn from that ancient quarrel? Well, first, this nation was born bickering. Disputation is in the national genome. Second, that there are foundational truths that not only are indeed true, but as Jefferson's Declaration insists, self-evident. Third, that leaders worthy of our enduring admiration rise to the cause with grit and wisdom and grace. And fourth, that whatever trials beset us today, we have overcome greater perils, existential perils, in the past. We're the beneficiaries of an enlightened political heritage handed down to us from that revolutionary generation after many subsequent struggles. It includes strictures on how to divide power and to keep it from concentrating in the hands of those who think primarily of themselves. We cannot let that heritage slip away. We cannot permit it to be taken away. We cannot be oblivious to this priceless gift, or the hundreds of thousands who have given their lives to affirm and sustain it. Now, the American Revolution was not a war between regimes or dynasties fought for territory or the usual commercial advantages, but rather an improvised struggle between two peoples of a common heritage who had been gradually sundered by divergent views and conflicting visions of what the world could become. The Americans, let's say us, eventually won by embracing fewer strategic misconceptions than the British did. Certainly the rebels could be wrong-headed in believing they had greater economic leverage over the mother country than they actually possessed, for example. Or in caricaturing George III, who sat on his throne for 60 years and was shrewder, more complex, and more admirable than the overbearing ninny who still dominates our imaginations and who minces across the stage night after night in Hamilton. Yet George and his ministers made three critical miscalculations. One, that most colonists remained loyal to the crown, notwithstanding troublemakers in New England capable of rousing a rabble. Two, that firmness, including military firepower, if necessary, would intimidate the obstreperous and restore harmony. And three, that failure to reassert London's authority in America would eventually unstitch the newly created British Empire, encouraging insurrections in Ireland, Canada, the West Indies, India. It's an 18th century version of the domino theory that would propel us into Vietnam 150 years or more later. Britain also underestimated the difficulty of waging a protracted war across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail for 8 years, as it turned out. Expeditionary warfare, whether waged in North America in the 18th century or in Central Asia in the 21st century, is among the hardest of all martial enterprises. The British Army in the Revolution, unable to gather food and forage from the American countryside without getting ambushed, relied largely on provisions shipped from England and Irish ports. But of 40 transport vessels, for example, dispatched across the Atlantic in the winter of 1775-76, only 8 of those 40 reached the King's forces in occupied Boston directly. The rest were blown by gales back to Britain or blown to the West Indies or intercepted by rebel marauders. Of 550 Lincolnshire sheep carried aboard ships that actually made it to Boston, that breed was deemed the fittest to undergo the rigors of transatlantic travel. Only 40 of those 550 sheep arrived alive. 290 hogs shipped, just 74 survived the trip. When the British moved to New York in the summer of 1776 and requested 950 horses to pull their artillery carriages and supply wagons, 412 of the 950 horses that were shipped from Britain died at sea during the voyage. Scores more were ruined beyond use. Similar difficulties plagued the British for years. Logistics is always hard in war. Any of you with military experience know that. Personally, I've seen just how hard it is in Somalia and Bosnia and Iraq and Afghanistan. Even when the American rebels were fighting on their home turf, they faced enormous difficulties. Of 75 official letters that General Washington wrote in January and February 1776, half mentioned munition shortages, often in pleading, fretful terms, especially gunpowder, which he just called the thing. It's difficult to make musket balls without lead. And by the summer of 1776, the Americans were desperately short of the stuff. In New York, more than 100 tons of lead weights from fishing nets and Clocks and window sash cords were collected to make bullets, along with lead from downspouts and window glass cames and pewter dishes. Without salt, armies and navies couldn't stockpile the meat and fish needed to move anywhere. 2 bushels of salt, it's more than 100 pounds, were needed to cure 1,000 pounds of pork. Before the war, the Americans imported 15 million bushels annually, half from the West Indies and half from Britain or Southern Europe. But when the shooting started, the British trade embargo strangled 2/3 of those imports. To encourage salt works along the coast, pamphlets were printed with salt-making recipes. All the old women and children are gone down to the Jersey shore to make salt, John Adams wrote. But 400 gallons of seawater are needed to boil off a bushel of salt, and that takes huge stockpiles of firewood. Virginia spent 6,000 pounds, a very large sum of money in those days, to build evaporation ponds along the Chesapeake Bay, but collected only 50 bushels. It's perhaps the most expensive salt in the history of salt. But those problems, substantial as they were, hardly matched Britain's problems. The 1,000 tons of bread required each month to feed British soldiers in New York often arrived from depots in Cork, moldy and infested with Irish rats. And there's no rat as nasty as an Irish rat. And they soon infested British storehouses on Staten Island. For the winter of 1776-77, the British needed 64,000 cords of firewood, 70 tons of candles. The daily allowance of a gill of rum for each redcoat, a gill was 5 ounces. It's about a gallon a month, which gives you an idea of inebriation problems in the British Army. It took an enormous amount of shipping space. Let's talk for a moment about George, our last king. He's an intriguing adversary. The late Queen Elizabeth II only recently opened up to outside scrutiny the Georgian papers, which she owned as part of a project to digitize and catalog the papers from all 4 Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are 350,000 pages, mostly from the reign Irish rats, yes. So the Orioles won, I can tell you that. There are 350,000 pages in the Georgian papers, most from the reign of George III, because he was king for 60 years, and most of them previously unpublished. I was one of the first allowed in to take a look for a whole month in April 2016 in Windsor Castle, just west of London, where the papers are stored. Every morning I would show my badge at the Henry VIII gate and again at the Norman gate. And then I would climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower, begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers in gorgeous, oversized red binders. George was his own secretary until late in life when he began to go blind. And he not only wrote most of his correspondence himself, he made the copies himself. And as you paw through these pages, there is a tactile sense of being in his presence. Among other things, he's a great list maker. Lists of British garrisons abroad from 1764 to 1775. Of Royal Navy vessels under construction in various shipyards. Of all his regiments in America, with the number of officers, musicians, and rank and file, for each tabulated with his arithmetic scratchings in the margins as he does his sums. George copied out his own recipes for cough syrup. Rosemary, rice, vinegar, brown sugar, all boiled in silver. An insecticide, wormwood, vinegar, lime, swine's fat, quicksilver. He's interested in everything from music and astronomy to horology, the study of time, and the use of manures in agronomy. He'd married an obscure, drab German princess. Charlotte, as in Charlottesville, Virginia, Charlotte, North Carolina. She learned to play God Save the King on the harpsichord during her voyage to England from Germany. They married 6 hours after they met. He had the marriage bedroom decorated with 700 yards of blue damask and large basins of goldfish, because nothing says I love you like a bowl of goldfish. The happy union proved fertile. She produced children with lunar regularity, eventually to number 15. And we see in his personal correspondence that George is a caring father. He's invested in the rearing of his kids. And through all this, he's trying to figure out the proper course for the British Empire, for the monarchy, and for his people. He's easy enough to dislike, but impossible, I find, to detest or simply to dismiss as a reactionary autocrat. The war he chooses to wage, and he chooses to wage the war, is brutal, bloody, and often savage. Unlike modern war, killing in the 18th century is usually intimate, at very close range, often face-to-face, often with a bayonet. That's partly because 18th century muskets were mostly inaccurate beyond 80 yards and almost hopeless beyond 100 yards or so. Scholars have calculated that in the fights at Lexington, Concord, and the British retreat to Boston on the first day of the war, April 19th, 1775, the Americans fired at least 75,000 rounds, but only one bullet in every 300 actually hit a redcoat. The shot heard round the world probably missed. Battlefield wisdom held that it took a man's weight in bullets to kill him in the 18th century, and that's not far from wrong. On the other hand, massed musket fire, clusters of men firing in volleys, sending swarms of 1-ounce lead slugs flying downrange at perhaps 1,000 feet a second, that could be devastating. A man 5 feet 8 inches tall, a little shorter than I am, had an exterior surface of 2,550 square inches, of which 1,000 were exposed to gunfire when he faced an enemy frontally at close range. Given the primitive inadequacy of 18th century medicine, which was hardly worthy of the name, if you're hit in the torso, you have more than a 50% chance of dying. If you're hit in the head, your chances of survival are even worse. By the way, later studies by the British Army demonstrated that soldiers wearing conspicuous red uniforms were more than twice as likely to be shot in combat as those in muted blues and grays. Duh. American marksmen, especially those few who carried rifles, which were more accurate than muskets but were harder to load and couldn't carry a bayonet, learned to target the brightest of the red coats because they were usually worn by officers who could afford the more expensive dyes to make those coats pop. In the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17th, 1775, the British captured roughly a square mile of rebel-held territory at a cost of over 1,000 casualties, including 226 British dead. The British are coming is not something Paul Revere bellowed while galloping through the Middlesex countryside in the very early morning of April 19, 1775. That wouldn't have made sense to people who at that moment still thought of themselves as British. What he's quoted as shouting over and over again is, the regulars are coming out, meaning the British regular troops coming out from Boston. But I use the British are coming as a title because it's a metaphor for what those first couple of years of the war are really about. The British are coming relentlessly, with most of their ferocious professional army, with nearly half of the greatest navy the world has ever seen, 30,000 German mercenaries. They're coming to kill your men, rape your women, plunder your homes, and burn your towns. It's a dire thing. Well, those are some of the nuts and bolts of 18th century warfare, but what of the emotional guts of the revolution? That's what still moves us, stirs our pride, makes us feel that those men and women of more than a dozen generations ago have something to say to us. Why is that? Certainly that revolutionary generation can seem so distant as to be almost a foreign people. If irony and skepticism are the twin lenses of modern consciousness, the revolutionaries often seem archaic. They are far less ironic and skeptical in their worldview than their 21st century descendants. They speak English, of course, but they have their own idiom and argot, their own slang. For example, passing counterfeit money, widely practiced in the 18th century, was known as shoving the queer. Someone who died took heaven by the way. Lice and fleas were known as livestock. British soldiers in Boston, by the way, sometimes referred to Americans derisively as Jonathan or Brother Jonathan. But those are minor differences. We rightly admire those Americans for their endurance, pertinacity, and sacrifice, not only displayed by men serving in the ranks, but by others swept up in the fraught events of those times. Lois Peters of Connecticut hadn't seen her husband, Captain Nathan Peters, in months when she wrote him, "Pray come home as soon as possible. A visit from you at any time would be agreeable." Meanwhile, she would harvest the corn, sell their oxen for enough cash to keep the family saddlery solvent, sew him a shirt, and take great pleasure doing it, she told him, and keep faith with the future. She signed all of her letters, "Your loving wife until dead." General Nathanael Greene makes one of the worst operational decisions of the war by leaving 3,000 American troops exposed and vulnerable on Manhattan Island at Fort Washington, where in the space of 8 hours in November 1776, they're trapped and killed or captured. This is during a period when American generalship is often characterized by miscalculation, misfortune, imprudence, and deficient military skill. But Greene picks himself up, takes a deep breath, and writes to Cotty, his wife, "The virtue of the Americans is put to a trial. I'm hearty and well amidst all the fatigues and hardships. Be of good courage. Don't be distressed. All things will turn out for the best." Be of good courage. He's speaking to us, to you. He's certainly speaking to me. The sheer drama of the revolution keeps it compelling and often thrilling, from the bloodletting at Bunker Hill, where 1 of every 8 British officers killed during the Long War would die in 4 hours, to the skin of the teeth escape by Washington and his army in the fog across the East River in August 1776 after a terrible drubbing on Long Island. And beyond the battlefield, the theatrical power and pathos of the conflict surely outruns any dramatist's imagination. The abrupt arrival of the septuagenarian Benjamin Franklin in Paris to woo the French absolute monarchy into an alliance with radical Republicans. The 100,000 smallpox deaths in North America from 1775 to 1782. Those white men sitting in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, lashing at horseflies with their handkerchiefs while carving up Thomas Jefferson's draft declaration to make it shorter and much better. The many American families, Ben Franklin's among them, ripped apart by irreconcilable political differences. If the central figures in our creation story have frequently been embalmed in reverence, they nonetheless remain beguiling, worthy of perpetual scrutiny and often of emulation. Washington is a case in point. Yes, he owned more than 300 slaves when he died at Mount Vernon in December 1799. You cannot square that circle morally. He demonstrated shortcomings as a tactical commander at Long Island, Fort Washington, Brandywine, other battlefields. The man who proverbially could never tell a lie sure could prevaricate. And Washington's carping about his troops and his officers and his lot in life I distrust everything, he grumbled in 1776, transforms the demigod into a sometimes petulant mortal. Yet great responsibility enlarges him. He rightly embodies the sacrifice of personal interest to a greater good, as well as other Republican virtues: probity, dignity, moral stamina, incorruptibility, traits that should remain true north for every citizen today, traits that should be required of our leaders at all levels. Washington's faith gave others faith. His strength made others strong. As commanding general of the Continental Army, the indispensable man commanding the indispensable institution, he also demonstrated a shrewd understanding of the refractory, independent peoples known collectively as Americans. Washington wrote in 1777, "A people unused to restraint must be led. They will not be drove." He was a leader. Lesser personalities, largely lost to history, speak to Americans in the 21st century of constancy and an antique patriotism. "Heaven only knows what may be my fate," Captain John McPherson wrote in a last letter to his father before being killed at Quebec. "I experience no reluctance in this cause to venture a life which I consider is only lent to be used when my country demands it." Likewise, Lieutenant Samuel Cooper wrote his wife, "The dangers we are to encounter I know not, but it shall never be said to my children, 'Your father was a coward.'" He too died at Quebec. Even Benedict Arnold, perhaps the finest battle captain on either side early in the war before his subsequent issues, wrote after being shot in the leg in Canada, "I am in the way of duty and I know no fear." Some years ago, the distinguished historian John Shai, who taught at the University of Michigan for many years, wrote that the Civil War, like every other major event in American history, including the Second World War, has a tragic, human, two-sided quality that the Revolution seems to lack. The whole complex of revolutionary events takes on a smooth, self-contained character that makes getting the right emotional grip on the subject very difficult. My premise is that tragedy is the bedrock of every war, because every war is about young men and now sometimes young women dying young. My ambition has been to find that emotional grip, as Professor Shai put it, to revive the tragic, human, multi-sided quality that saturates the American saga from 1775 to 1783. So we see Lieutenant Edward Hull. He's a young Scottish officer in the 43rd Regiment of Foot, shot at North Bridge in Concord, then shot again during the British retreat toward Boston, captured by the Americans in agony from 3 bullet wounds, sucking on an orange donated by a compassionate rebel. He lingers for nearly 2 weeks in a twilight of pain and remorse before he too takes heaven, by the way. Or we see Mary Pierce, the widow of a private killed at Bunker Hill while fighting in the Massachusetts militia, as she petitions the Commonwealth for precisely £5 and 12 shillings in compensation for her husband's lost coat, trousers, stockings, shoes, buckles, silk handkerchief, knife, and tobacco box. Or General Richard Montgomery, the commander in the assault on Quebec, hit by grape shot through both thighs and mortally through the face. His effects were auctioned off to his officers a couple days after his death, item by item. 2 volumes of Polybius, Johnson's Dictionary, a buffalo skin, and a clothes brush bought by Captain Aaron Burr, and a wardrobe including ruffled shirts, holland waistcoats, and a pair of tea-tongs, all bought by his deputy commander, Benedict Arnold. Or we see Ile Noire, the island of nuts. It's a couple hundred acres in the Richelieu River just above the New York border, where thousands of American soldiers retreating from Canada in June 1776 jammed a malarial hell, half of them suffering from smallpox, dysentery, typhus, or some other god-awful malady, infested with lice and maggots. One doctor wrote, "We had nothing to give them. It broke my heart, and I wept till I had not more power to weep." And we see Matthew Patton of Bedford, New Hampshire, whose son John had survived a gunshot wound to the arm at Bunker Hill, but did not survive Île Noire. Mr. Patton wrote simply in his diary, "I got an account of my John's death of the smallpox at Canada. He was 24 years and 31 days old." The historian Bruce Catton considered the American Civil War a redemptive tragedy. Surely the same can be said of the American Revolution. It embodied the enduring aspirations of an idealistic people and brought forth a nation abounding with a sense of destiny. No wonder the world was agog. "The cause of America," wrote the essayist Thomas Paine, "is the cause of all mankind." Even now, the war for independence offers clues to our national temperament. It remains a bright mirror in which we see traits that fashion the American character, from ingenuity and resilience to brutality and pugnacity. We've come far in almost 2.5 centuries in power, diversity, tolerance, and sheer scale. But in some sense, those ancestors remain nearer than we know. Their existential struggle churned up issues that perplex us to this day, including individual liberty versus collective security, the proper limits on executive power, the obligations of citizenship, and the elusive quest for a more equitable society. The tacit primal question of 1776 persists in 2023. Who do we want to be? In 1789, Benjamin Franklin died at the age of 84 in the house he owned on Market Street in Philadelphia. But a few months before he passed, he wrote in a letter to a friend one of the lines for which he's best remembered. "Our new Constitution is now established. Everything seems to promise it will be durable, but in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes." What he's telling us, virtually from the grave, is that there's work to be done. The dream endures, but so does the struggle. Democracy is never a thing done, the poet and librarian of Congress, Archibald MacLeish, told us. Democracy is always something that a nation must be doing. Even Jefferson's Declaration, our foundational secular scripture, we hold these truths to be self-evident, is dynamic, never a thing done, something a nation must be doing. The great Yale historian Edmund Morgan wrote that the creed of equality did not give men and women equality, but invited them to claim it, invited them not to know their place and keep it, but to seek and demand a better place. The American Revolution lasted 3,089 days, and the result was epical and enduring, the creation of the American Republic, among mankind's most remarkable achievements. Nearly 90,000 more days have elapsed since those horsefly-swatting men asserted a human birthright of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Keeping faith with those who fought, suffered, and died for the principles we profess to still cherish requires more than a nodding acquaintance with them, more than a perfunctory acknowledgement of their struggles. For better and for worse, their story is our story, and their fight remains our fight. Thanks again for having me here this evening. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that.